Okay, hello everyone, so nice to see you. So my name's Angela Willits, for those of you that I don't know, although I think I know almost all of you. So a couple of announcements before we start with our talk today. First, to introduce my co-presenter, Jennifer Ginsberg, who I'll let you introduce yourself before we jump in. But I just had a couple of acknowledgments. So 3 weeks ago, we had our first talk in this series on trauma-informed care, and Scott Webb from the state came and talked with us about that. And so I want to acknowledge that when I give a brief review of what is trauma-informed care, some of that comes from some of the information that he provided. So that's one. Two, one thing I wanted to say, although I only have one person here to acknowledge, is that when I started thinking about this brown bag series, it was last fall when I was teaching 440, which is generalist social work practice. And so my students in that class helped me in sort of the early stages of brainstorming what would we want to talk about when we're talking about trauma-informed care, and what are the different areas. So I said, I actually made them find research articles for me in class, and I said, if you do this, I'll acknowledge you when I give this talk. So I want to acknowledge Courtney, who's here today, as one of the people in the class who did that. And then the third acknowledgement is I want to acknowledge Jennifer Sampson, who's a student in the part-time program who's doing an independent study with me on trauma and trauma-informed care, some of the things that we've been talking about, and she's actually helped give me fuel for things that I'm going to talk about today and in 2 weeks. So thanks, Jennifer. So there are copies of the slides going around. There's also CEUs for today's talk, if any of you are interested in collecting those. And then there's a flyer where you have to see more of me about the talk in 2 weeks, which is going to be on trauma-informed educational settings, things like classrooms and schools of social work. So without further ado, I'll let Jennifer introduce herself.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Jennifer Ginsberg, and I'm a social worker. I'm the program director at Safe Harbor Child Advocacy Center here in Madison. I teach a class here in the School of Social Work called Interviewing Children and Involuntary Clients, which is going on right now. And I've been in the field of doing trauma work for over 20 years, working in generally nonprofit agency settings around sexual assault, domestic violence, family violence, as well as doing trauma-focused therapy and training. And so I have a lot of experience and a lot of, both good and bad experiences with sort of what happens in an agency when there's not trauma-informed supervision, it's not a trauma-informed environment for staff. And so I'm really happy to be here and to sort of see this movement kind of happening, because I feel like the students and people coming out of this program and with this information are going to be the change agents in the agencies, and so I'm just really happy that Angela had the foresight and agency to get this series started. So I'm really happy to just be a part of it and contribute what I can about trauma-informed supervision, particularly with sort of concrete examples and agency experience. So,
great, thank you. So the way that it'll go today is I'm going to sort of do the first part that's going to cover more foundationally what is supervision, what are we talking about when we talk about trauma-informed care, and the goals for that really are that we just have sort of an established understanding of these terms that we're going to use throughout the time today. And then Jennifer's going to talk about what does it look like to incorporate trauma-informed care into the supervisory process, the supervision process. And one of our big goals there is really to introduce practical ideas for how you might do this. If you're not a supervisor already, you will, I have confidence, be a supervisor maybe sooner than you think. So to give you, like Jennifer said, some of those sort of concrete tools for how you might be more trauma-informed in your supervision. And then towards the end, more briefly, we'll just touch on what makes this hard to do. So what can get in the way of implementing trauma-informed practices in supervision. So I think most of us agree a trauma-informed approach is a good idea, right? It makes a lot of sense. It seems in the best interest of of anyone, and yet I think we can probably acknowledge that there's things that can make it tricky to do with work with clients, but also in supervision, and even in educational settings like this one. So we'll touch on that a little bit, and then that'll be the day. Any questions, comments, things you have to, I came here for this before we move into what we're going to talk about? Okay. So what is supervision? We all have a sense of this because you've all had a supervisor, maybe you've been a supervisor, but just to give us kind of a shared understanding of what this is, and especially how it ties into trauma-informed care. So ideally, a couple of quotes here that I like about supervision. Ideally, supervision is a reflective process that provides a physical and emotional safe space and opportunity to examine the clinical work of the practitioner with the goals to enhance personal and professional growth, shape competence, and promote a high level of services. Supervision is a critical strategy in helping practitioners address challenges and prevent, mitigate, and heal vicarious trauma. So of course this isn't an exhaustive definition of what is supervision, but as it relates to what we're talking about today, I think these are some important aspects of what good supervision includes. So 3 functions of supervision, if we wanted to try to sum this up, and again, this list isn't exhaustive. So there's the educational component of supervision, right? So all of you who have a supervisor, they're teaching you a whole lot about how the agency runs, about how to fill out particular paperwork properly, about the skills and interventions that you're learning, right? So there's the educational piece that a supervisor addresses. And hopefully they're also teaching you about how to be trauma-informed in your work with clients, and hopefully that's a part of the teaching. And then there's the supportive component of supervision, which sometimes is a really big part of supervision, right? Supervisors help supervisees in critical self-reflection and emotional literacy. So a strong supervisor is hopefully going to ask their supervisees, how are you feeling about this case? Or how's this going for you? So kind of that emotional reflective process and making room for that helps supervisees sort of recognize their vulnerabilities and resilience relative to trauma content. So we would hope that when people in the field are being confronted with traumatic material, that the supervisor can step in and say, how's this affecting you? Or perhaps, I noticed that this is affecting you. I'm hearing that this is tough for you to talk about, right? Identifying personal issues that may be impacting the work, and that could be a range of things. Burnout could be one of those. Secondary trauma could be one. Family life could be another, or unexpected things happening. Providing emotional support around coping with work-related challenges and stresses. So support in the form of, yeah, this is a hard job, and there's a super high demand, and we are expecting a lot, and I know that there's only so much time in the day, and I get that. So things like that. And then there's the administrative piece of supervision. And so there's lots that goes into the administrative piece, but some things that might include that are the supervisor may be the one that sets the caseload, right? So helps the supervisee manage their load, determines when the supervisee is expected to take on new clients. And with our students, hopefully the supervisor functions as sort of a filter for what clients does the student end up getting, right? So managing caseload, guiding the agency's policies and practices, and hopefully those are trauma-informed policies and practices. But that administrative piece. And then, we can't ignore the fact that supervisors also play an evaluation role, right? So for our students in field placements, at the end of each semester, the supervisor is engaging in some evaluation. And in professional settings of paid staff in supervision, it's often the same supervisor who might be providing clinical supervision as the supervisor who's doing the performance review annually, right? So that, we'll talk about that later on in what makes it tricky, but that evaluation component, we wouldn't want to disregard that piece of it. Okay, so that's what supervision is in a nutshell. It's that easy. Just kidding. Any questions about that, or things that you would add about what supervision is? Okay. So now to get us on the same page, what is trauma-informed care? And so we had our great brown bag a few weeks ago that did a much better job than I'm going to do at talking about trauma-informed care. But I wanted to just pull out some highlights in case you weren't able to come to that, just so that the rest of this talk is applicable and makes sense. So what is trauma-informed care? So in an organization, and trauma-informed care, when it's being practiced properly, it really needs to be structurally within the organization. It needs to be a way of doing things from frontline clerical staff to frontline providers to managers, and it needs to be the way the system works. So in organizations, a principle-based culture change process for creating an environment and culture that understands the effects of trauma and wants people to get the support and help they need. So as a professional setting, as a culture, we recognize the impact of trauma and we want to be responsive to it. We don't want to pretend that it's not there. Trauma-informed care is also a way of being, interacting, and talking with people that does not cause additional harm. So that's probably a huge part of trauma-informed care, that with everything that we do, the way we interact, what we say, how we say it, the space that we meet in, the way we move about in the room, that we're sensitive to the way that people are impacted by trauma. It emphasizes consideration of how trauma has affected an individual's life and their responses to experiences. And the big take home that you'll hear over and over again when you hear about trauma-informed care is, rather than this sort of blaming lens, labeling lens of what's wrong with you, or here's your problem, or here's how you're not doing this correctly or not fitting the mold, or being resistant or having problematic behaviors, rather than wondering about that, wondering about what happened to you. So this doesn't mean that we would explicitly ask a supervisee what happened to you, but we would hold in our mind this wondering, how could this be a response to trauma? So what happened rather than what's wrong to you. What it is not, trauma-informed care is not an intervention or treatment for PTSD. So I say that whenever I talk about trauma-informed care because I've heard people mix up those two, that they think of trauma-informed care as an actual treatment or intervention, and that is what it's not. It's a way of being. It's a way of being. It's not a way of treating, okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So there's a few main principles to trauma-informed care. The biggest one is this universal precautions idea. We need to presume the clients we serve have a history of traumatic stress and exercise universal precautions by creating systems of care that are trauma-informed. Now this quote will come up a little later when Jennifer's talking, when we're talking about supervisees. I think if we're practicing from a trauma-informed lens, we need to make this same assumption about supervisees. So we apply this not only to clients, but to staff and supervisees. So the next two slides are the other things when you're learning about trauma-informed care that you'll always hear. So sometimes this is called the 3 R's, but SAMHSA updated this and now there's actually 4 R's. So I've got the 4 listed here. So the first is realize the widespread impact of trauma. So that's the first step in being trauma-informed care, is to truly realize how widespread the impact of trauma is. So some statistics, about half the general population reports experiencing a traumatic event in their lifetime or an adverse event. 90% of people seeking some sort of behavioral health report some sort of traumatic event. And if we're thinking about this setting, which I'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks, 66 to 85% of college students report exposure to one or more traumatic events. So it's not a rare thing, it's not an abnormal experience. We're perhaps, when you look at the statistics, more likely than not to experience a trauma. So realize the widespread impact of trauma. The second is recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and students. So being able to recognize that the behaviors that we are in the presence of may be adaptations to trauma. So before we call them something else, trauma-informed care means recognizing, considering that this is an adaptation to trauma. The third R is respond, by integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So policies and procedures, that's more of a top-down consideration. So at an organizational level, how do we respond in a way that's trauma-informed? And then practices, that might be what we do with clients, with colleagues, or other coworkers, or staff, or supervisees. And then that 4R that is more newly added is resist re-traumatization, which kind of gets at the heart of trauma-informed care. Just that, again, sort of doing no harm, recognizing that practices can be re-traumatizing and that we should try to make changes where possible. Okay, so that's the 4 R's, and then the last slide that I'll talk about before I turn it over to Jennifer is the 6 key principles in trauma-informed care. So if we are working from a trauma-informed place, here's what we're aspiring to do, or these are the areas we're aspiring to take into consideration. The first is safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, which includes voice and choice, and then cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so Jennifer is going to now talk about sort of each of these in more detail. What do we mean by each of these? And then what do they look like in trauma-informed supervision?
Okay. Thank you, Angela. Oops. Okay, so I'm just going to do this. So another reason I think that this is important for you, not only as potential supervisors in the future, but also in terms of what you might look for as you're interviewing for jobs or field placements, that kind of thing, about what is a trauma-informed work environment and what does trauma-informed supervision look like. Because if you are going to be in an environment where you're dealing with traumatic material, it's really important that you can sort of establish that those things are in place. So part of, I think, the other sort of lens in which to listen to this information is to think for yourself, like, am I getting these things? Are these things present where I work? Or if you're assessing another, a place for a job or field placement, is this something that's present? And then if you're in a position to do so, to look at how can we incorporate some of these things into the setting where I am. The other piece I'm going to incorporate, I think, is the individual supervision as well as team supervision. So the idea of what's happening to the team and what are some sort of organizational strategies as well as individual strategies. And I'm really motivated on this topic because I feel like I've really seen the result of what happens when there's not the trauma-informed supervision. And that goes to the piece around the adaptations to trauma that Angela talked about and that we'll be talking about here. You can tell this is not like my full-time world here.
If you do the arrow.
Press on that arrow there. There we go. So the trauma-informed approach, as Angela talked about, my experience has been as well, and I would imagine your experiences too, is that in addition to the high prevalence of trauma within students is the high prevalence of trauma within social work students specifically. Many people go into the field because they're very motivated to address certain issues that may be issues for them in their past. And so I think just that recognition that people coming in may have issues that are going to present themselves. And that can be in any kind of role. I think a good example of one thing I was dealing with today is that we've had a suicide of an offender in one of our cases. And so recognizing that some staff, for instance, have, I know, histories where suicide was, has impacted them. And so even just to be able to recognize coming in to work today that there's going to be a lot of talk around suicide, even though these two people aren't actually very involved in the case, but we're a tiny agency and everyone's offices are crowded together. So to give them sort of a heads up or a trigger warning, as you might say today, that's going to be an issue that's going to be coming up. So just that recognition that for everybody present, that trauma is going to be a piece of what they're dealing with, and to recognize the span of what those traumas can be. So assuming the supervisee has had exposure to trauma, and assuming that the trauma will affect them. I mean, I think it's really important with students that I supervise and with staff that I supervise. I put out very plainly that it's not an aberration or a rare thing to be experiencing symptoms and effects from the trauma work. And so laying that as the groundwork of that, so it's something that I'm bringing up. It's a lot of like when you work with trauma victims that you need to sort of present as the person who you can say these things to, and I understand that these things happen in the world. It's the same with supervision. Now, there's a really overt presence of that, that the effect of this trauma work takes many forms, but it's expected that this will affect you in various ways. And recognizing that the experiences will impact trauma. And again, I think it's a recognition both of the supervisor and to the supervisee that really, again, laying the groundwork for that person that to really talk about what are the symptoms, what would they potentially look like, how to sort of be aware of those things going in, and that of course becomes sort of tailored to that individual person. And we'll talk more about kind of dealing with those as it comes up, but really again that overt process of the recognizing that it happens and that each person is going to have their own individual adaptations. So safety is part of trauma-informed care and as part of supervision. So so things around the environment that are listed there. I think other things I would add to that people are aware of are posters and comics and things like that. And I'm not trying to create this sort of environment where there's no fun and no personal expression. But I'll give you an example is that, and a good example of a trauma-informed thing that I have not done, which is, I think Courtney, who's placed with us, might know, but there's one office that's not our agency, it's the place where we share, has a magnet or whatever. It says, don't get raped, but the get is crossed out. So it's like, don't rape. I'm not explaining, but do you get what I'm saying? So I see that every time I come in the door. And it doesn't bother me so much, but I've been meaning to say to that person, like, I think for some of your clients, just seeing the word, like I get it, but it's sort of a sophisticated concept and your brain is still maybe not sorting that out. So that's just an example of seeing your environment through a trauma-informed lens. This is, maybe just social work humor, but back when I was doing trauma treatment and working with a lot of adult survivors of sexual abuse, we realized that some of the stuffed animals in certain offices were very sort of phallic looking, and we're like, maybe this giraffe or whatever it was should not be, like we really were looking at like, let's see this through a different lens. And so when we're looking at environment, it's it might be the things that don't automatically come to you. And I'll give one example that I've learned this over the years where I work, same thing, which is that the windows in our office, if you're looking at someone and they're backlit, you see them in the dark. And nobody would ever say anything. The way the office was positioned, no one ever saying that I was backlit. So whoever I was talking to couldn't actually see me. You're kind of shadowed, especially with the afternoon light. And it wasn't until I sat in that chair to talk to somebody else and I realized, like, oh, this is a terrible setup. But no supervisee I talked to ever said, actually, could we change the chairs around? And so, now I'm in the place of always making sure that that's not the setup or asking to make sure that the setup's okay. So it's little details like that. Consistent times and days for supervision. We will talk about that when we talk about barriers and limited resources, but it's that expectation. And again, when you think about trauma and you think about safety, consistency and predictability are really important safety mechanisms for dealing with trauma. And it's the same for trauma-informed supervision, that someone can count on their supervisor being available on a certain day and a certain time. Minimal interruptions, I think, really in our day of phones and emails, and like there's so many ways that we can be interrupted. And it can take a lot of work to really put your full attention on something. And I've definitely been called out before for, are my eyes glancing over to the computer because I'm looking at email or whatever. And I think I'm attending, like I don't think I'm distracted. I think I'm very present. But it's also that felt effect of the person that you're talking with. And then the other piece about, well, I'll put it on trustworthiness and transparency. The other piece I guess I want to sort of talk about in terms of the communication is that that idea of what we said before in terms of really being clear about that this is something we can talk about, and it's an expectation that that we would be talking about it. So trustworthiness and transparency, again, that's a part of trauma-informed care. So in supervision, it's that being present, as we talked about, listening without judgment. And I think that sounds a lot easier than it is. But I really harken back to the idea of when you're working with trauma survivors of sort of being that person who can hear what you have to say, who you don't have to take care of, who's prepared to handle the material, give forth. That's the same kind of thing that you're giving to the supervisees. And then that transparency piece, I think, just in supervision in general, is also sort of that hierarchy kind of a thing where, when you have a lot of closed door meetings, and I've been in situations where, the management staff has so many closed door meetings that there's just no trust of the management staff. So that it's really hard to then shift gears and have that person say, tell me everything you're experiencing right now. You might be kind of like, I don't know, because I don't know if you're going to go in that closed door meeting and talk about it. And that's that sort of I think maybe it was on the previous slide, also around confidentiality and that kind of thing, like really sort of setting the tone of what you can share in here, being transparent about what I will and will not share with, say there's another supervisor above you, really having those boundaries really clear to create that sense of safety, that this is a safe place to talk about things. Assisting in reflection, the other piece, and a lot of this sort of connects together, is that ability to listen and not jump in with solutions. And in my interviewing class, we talk a lot about that because that's our real natural impulse to try to solve problems and try to jump in to help. And so it's like, in terms, again, you're assessing for yourself, it's like, is supervision a space where I can talk about what I'm experiencing? Or is it a space where the supervisor's more analyzing for problems that they can then fix? That makes sense? That's sort of a subtle difference there. And then sharing power and decision making, I guess it's under here, isn't it? That power and decision making takes many, many forms. But again, it's that idea of how much control do I have over my schedule, over my choices, and I'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. But that goes with the transparency piece, with that trustworthiness piece, and the idea that there's some egalitarian sort of approach there. Choice, that's what I was going for. So the other piece of trauma-informed care is choice. If any of you have worked with sexual assault survivors, one of our basic sort of tenets is, like in crisis intervention, is like, do you want a blanket versus here's a blanket? Like those tiny choices help a person regain a sense of control. So it can be things of whether it's even scheduling. I'm available at 2 or 2:30. What's best for you? versus let's have supervision tomorrow, 2 o'clock, without asking for that choice. And the active participation in decision making. So supervising has a say in setting of order of topics. And I would also talk about the say at managing workload, I think is a really important one. So one antidote we know to vicarious trauma is a couple things. One is having a diversity of workload, caseload, so that you're not dealing with all trauma cases. Now that, when we talk about limitations, that's one of the big limitations. Like where I work, I say, you know, we're all child abuse all the time. Like there is no other case. And then just recently I was talking to someone at Journey Mental Health about writing a grant to get a trauma therapist. And I had this vision that that's all this person would do. They'd be like 100. And she's like, well, I would never have a staff person that's only doing trauma treatment. I was like, oh, right. I forgot that that's a possibility, but it's that kind of vigilance to managing caseload, and that the individual worker has choice, and that goes back to that individual trauma piece. For some people, like I mentioned, it might be suicide. For some people, it might be sexual abuse. For some people, it might be divorce. It might be domestic violence. We have our individual triggers and things. So what it means to vary a caseload is going to mean different things to different people. And so rather than a supervisor saying you're going to have 20% this and 30% this and 10% this, to give the supervisee a chance to say, here's what I'd like my caseload to look like, but really knowing that along with that choice is that I don't know that people are that good at doing that for themselves, particularly when they're early in their career. I mean, you see a lot of people saying, I'll take anything, give it all to me or whatever. But knowing from a trauma-informed care perspective and in trauma-informed supervision that is a recipe for problems down the road. And so to be really insistent on, no, we need to vary your caseload, but you're giving choice. What ideas do you have for how we can do that? But then that's a barrier because that's a conversation I'm not able to have very much with the people I work with. The other issue is, what's not the word on here, is schedules. We've been really lucky where I am in that it's just sort of happened this way where pretty much everybody is actually part-time. So everybody has a day off in the week. And I think given the high trauma level of the caseload that we work with, I think that's worked out really well. But where it's things like, again, like looking at the schedule, so if someone is part-time, is it better to come in on a Tuesday and a Wednesday together? Is it better to have a day off in between? Is it better to make sure you have Fridays off to have a long weekend or be able to travel to see your family? So looking at how to manage caseload and how to manage a schedule, even if it's a full-time schedule. I have one person who has asked, could they do like a 12 to 8? So they have that morning to go to exercise class or whatever. So managing caseload and managing schedules. Let's see. So the collaboration and mutuality, which is a lot of what we've already talked about, and that it's where the experience, the expertise of the student is, or the supervisee is really recognized. And honestly, I feel like that is a dynamic you want in supervision of all kinds in all places. I hope that everyone feels that their expertise is recognized and valued. But understanding that you are, again, just like in trauma treatment and trauma-informed care, is you're coming in as the expert on you, the expert on your experience, and that expertise is recognized. So I think one thing I want to say about this piece is, again, I think a lot of it is just really good supervision. But I think one piece of trauma-informed supervision is really being able to talk about, and this kind of connects to safety, I think, is to really be able to talk about like what is happening and what can you do about it, and being able to practice some of the ways to handle certain situations. I think I'm trying to give a good example. Well, I think the more skill building that can happen within supervision, the more that increases the amount of empowerment. But to really be able to look at what are the to be able to identify sort of examples of situations where the student might be struggling, to be able to build skills around that. The other safety piece, and I wrote all these notes just while Angela was talking, and I should have done that. But the other safety piece is just to be able to create that environment that says, you can talk about this and we will address it, and let's talk with some real concrete examples about how to address it. Challenges and success. Yeah, Angela, sorry.
Well, so it's just making me think of something that you said at the very beginning about it being the supervisor's responsibility to sort of open the door to this is, this is also something we're going to talk about. It's not just going to be how to do the skills or the way we do things around here, but we're also going to talk about how you're doing and what this is like for you. But at the same time, the other piece of empowerment is the better trained staff are around how to do the work, the more protected they are from secondary traumatization. That's one of the protective factors. So it's this balancing, and I'm guessing you'll talk about it when we talk about challenges. It's this balancing of teaching the skills and empowering them to be efficacious in whatever the services they're delivering, with making the space and time and opening the door for, let's talk about how you're doing and talk about risks and to burnout or secondary trauma.
Well, and I would say, I think in many respects it can almost be the opposite balance, that there's so much focus on the skill building that the other piece of efficacy is that dealing with the trauma and the secondary trauma symptoms that you're experiencing is part of the work. And it'll make you better at what you do. That gets not this side issue. It is central to the work that you're doing. So, yeah. So I agree. Those and but I feel like sometimes in when we get into barriers, that sometimes I feel like it's this emphasis on how to do the work, that we're so focused on doing that we ignore this other sphere of things that are happening for people. So what are some of the challenges? They're like so many. For me, it's the absence of policies and resources that I think lack of resources is a big problem. For instance, I know that, the research has been clear for a long time that staff doing trauma work, like at domestic violence agencies, was where a lot of the research was, that they should have monthly, secondary trauma groups, and groups for the staff, and where supervisors aren't present, and there's all these outlines of things. But you survey DV agencies across the nation, they're not doing it, and because it's a resource, because they don't have the time, they don't have the money to pay somebody to do it, they're already short-staffed. So I often think that we're better on, we know what should be done versus actually implementing it. But I think you have to start with that policy piece. If there's not that recognition and that knowledge about what's important, it certainly won't be happening. And resources, like we talked about, diversifying caseload, like that is something that certain structures and resources can't do, like at our agency. And so we're to the point where someone's on for the day, they can't even trade off cases I've done child sexual abuse all day, can I not do this one? They don't have the choice if they're the only one there. That's a resource issue to get a second person there. We are hiring for a bilingual family advocate, by the way, bilingual in Spanish, if you know anybody. Limited time to, and I feel like this is a really big one, which is it goes to that piece of, nonprofit agencies tend to be really busy and work really hard, and people are moving like that. And so there's not the time to sort of to take the pause and look at, how are you doing, as Angela said. I'll give an example, staying with that suicide example for today. One of my colleagues who I supervise said today, and she's like, you got it, this is the third suicide I've had this year. And I did not remember. Like that, I was like, whoa, I've sort of missed the fact that this has been happening. I mean, we tend to get, that happens, but I didn't realize they were all for hers, and she's so high functioning, for lack of a better phrase, that, that she was able, so I don't think I gave the time to it, so she didn't give the time to it and went on and did her work. And so that I wasn't able, and coming in today, to recognize, like, this is the third, that she fortunately was able to identify that for herself and say that to me. But I think, that's where that limited time piece really comes in, even in a cumulative way. And I think the other piece is the supervisor or supervisee's discomfort in exploring personal reactions. And I would argue that it's often a supervisor's discomfort. Or as my cousin likes to say about his sister, he'll say, don't ask her how she is, because she'll tell you. So, I do feel like there's a sense of asking, if you're going to ask, how are you, you need to be prepared to hear that answer. And I think people, whether it's clients, whether supervisees are really good at knowing if that person really wants to hear that answer. And so I think as a supervisor, it's really being able to communicate through the other things that we talked about, the presence and attention focus and the openness and the trustworthiness and transparency, say that when I ask, like, how are you doing with this case, how are you feeling, that they feel like they can say.
Jennifer, can I say a piece?
Of course, please.
So I've gone around to a handful of agencies and done trainings on secondary vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, whatever you want to call it, or burnout. And I always emphasize that one of the protective factors against this is the supervisor and supervision. And a lot of what we're saying today around trauma-informed care, it's the same thing, that the supervisor pays attention to this and checks in with their clients. And what I often hear sometimes afterwards from supervisors is, I know my staff are tapped to the max. I know we don't have the resources, and there's nothing I can do about it. So if I ask them, how are you? And they tell me they're not doing okay, but I need them here, otherwise we're going to be in worse shape, and there's nothing I can do about the demand that's coming in or the demand that my upper management is putting on me, then what? What can I do about it? So I think, kind of going along with what you're saying, one of the reasons supervisors may not explore this is because they feel that their hands are completely tied to actually address it in a helpful way.
That's a really good point. And I think the supervisee reluctance, I think, also comes to connecting to that is that piece of evaluation that Angela mentioned. I think for supervisees, the wonder is, well, if I talk about this, like, is this a safe place to talk about it, or will I have some repercussions? And that's why the recommendation is often to have sort of groups and settings where you can say, I've been curled in the fetal position under my desk, and not feel like I'm going to get written up for saying that. But outside of that circumstance is for the supervisor to be able to say, that the supervisory piece here about your performance is your willingness to talk about these things, that we can address these problems and talk about the impact on you and the impact on clients, and it's not going to have a personal ramification. But that is certainly one big barrier, is that supervisor is often in an evaluation kind of component. The other thing I think that's it's that embarrassment, the belief that it should be private. I think the other thing is just even the way we're talking about it is that for this to really talk about it needs more than the general question of how are you? Poor Courtney knows, I ask questions, I'm sure that she's just like, oh my God. But I'll really go down like, well, how is this? And how are you feeling at work? And how are you feeling, how is it being with your friends? And are you able to do your previously enjoyable activities? Are you running? Are you this? How's your personal relationships? How, really going down. What are your support systems? What are you doing? It's those specific questions. So we don't, because what happens when you ask people how they are? We usually go, fine. Right? And so if supervisor's not getting specific about what we need to talk about, I feel like the person's not going to say, yeah.
I guess part of that, though, is, and this has come up even not only in professional supervision, but in fact, going faculty roles here, different people choose to deal with things in different ways. And so some folks will be like, maybe in a field seminar, we'll talk about what's going on and be emotional, and others will share a piece of something and it's very clear they don't want to talk about it anymore, that they may have their own place to do it in. And so I think part of the balance is, because again, with that judging, evaluating that comes with supervising, is this need to comply or go along with
that's
this.
a great point.
It may not feel good.
That's a great point. And I think, what I do, because there's definitely a range, and I have one person who would, right, she's not going to tell me, and that's totally fine. And so what I do, which is what I often would do with trauma survivors too, is that I will say it. Rather than put it as a question, I might say, you might find that you're experiencing X, Y, and Z. And if you do, just to know that that's a really normal process, and hopefully you can find someone you can talk to or whatever. I also have at work, I have workbooks and that kind of thing available. I might advise other kinds of models, try to send articles. So, and I do find that with trauma survivors too. It's like sometimes I'll just do the saying so that they're not in that position of having to answer a question. And then I'm going to see if there's anything else. No, and then I just think that it's, I think the other piece for supervisors and the part that motivates me, like I said, I've seen the negative, what happens if you don't do this, that this isn't just a luxury of time and resources, because I've been in organizations that are really great and trauma-informed with the clients, but not with the staff. And then you have staff that are literally about to rip each other's hair out because someone left the sticky notes in the wrong place. Like they start arguing over minutia, they're battling with each other, they're not, because they can't talk about it in supervision, they're saying they're going out for home visits and they're not actually going on the home visits. They're having all the symptoms of secondary trauma around losing their empathy and the negative worldview and maybe some dissociative pieces. Their relationships are troubled at home, and the whole work environment becomes toxic. So that it's not just a luxury of having the healthiest employees, but it's really important to the health of the organization and the treatment that we offer, the services that we offer to clients.
I just came up here because I was going to do the next slide, but I don't want to rush you on.
Oh, no, I don't. No, I think the only other, and I will, don't open the door for me because I'm the person who will continue to talk. But at the very beginning, I talked about trauma-informed supervision as a key to sort of helping to prevent secondary trauma. And while it's not, trauma-informed care is not trauma treatment or treatment for PTSD, it is very much connected to how to manage vicarious trauma and secondary trauma in the workplace. And that it is just a really essential component to preventing that among the staff, because that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about exploring that trauma. So that's all I got.
Awesome. Great. So, and so that ties into just this piece of really protecting our most valuable resources, which is our staff. And so if we go back to sort of that broader acknowledgement that many people are impacted by trauma themselves, or in the nature of this work, we are going to be impacted by the content, the trauma content that we're exposed to. So if we're not operating from a trauma-informed lens and doing all these, lots of great examples that you came up with from your own practice, we're really not protecting this resource, this most valuable resource in our setting. Any questions? Yeah.
How important is it to distinguish between what is trauma and traumatic for someone or versus something that's unfortunate, difficult, frustrating?
Yeah.
What distinguishes and how do you use language, I guess, that sort of if everything is trauma, then nothing is trauma?
Right.
Kind of that.
Yeah.
How do you see that operating within your work?
I have thoughts about that.
Go ahead.
So people have heard me talk about this a fair amount about what is trauma and what isn't trauma, because if we're following the APA's definition in DSM-5, there's pretty clear-cut criteria of what consists as a traumatic event. If we think about the ACE study, for example, adverse childhood events, you could argue that some of the things on that list, would we actually define those as a trauma? It's really more about your personal reaction to things. Mm-hmm. So sometimes people want to get really hung up around, well, is that divorce, for example, is one that comes up a lot. It's really difficult life experience, right? Some might even say an adverse life event. But DSM would say that doesn't meet criteria for a trauma, right? So rather than get hung up on, at least, and this is just my view, what is a trauma versus what isn't a trauma, I'm more curious about how is it affecting the person? What is this like for you? And if you're dreaming about this, if this is popping into your head, if you're sitting in class and you're trying to take notes and this image is popping up for you, or when you think about it, you have a high emotional reactivity to it. Whether certain definers would say that it's trauma or not, it's affecting you, and so I want us to be able to talk about that. So in my clinical work, I had to pay a lot of attention to if something actually met criteria for diagnostically for a trauma. In the role that I'm in now as an educator and in keeping my classroom a safe, supporting environment where students can learn, can be present and learn, I don't have to worry as much about that. So I guess I can't speak as a supervisor to how important is it to make that distinction, what is a trauma or what isn't, but my general response would be I just think it's important to be curious about the impact. That's what I'm more curious about.
Well, I think I'm looking as a supervisor more at secondary trauma symptoms, and that's why I ask those questions like, are you able to concentrate? Are you concentrating in class? How are you sleeping? And someone's saying, I'm having nightmares, and I keep thinking about this client in class, and to me, those are symptoms of a trauma response, regardless of whether they've had any primary trauma of their own. And the thing I also try to work on with more veteran workers is that who've had so much trauma exposure is that what are the things within this big trauma bucket that affect you? So, people find like, well, it's the grandfather cases, or it's the ones where it's this or that. Like there are details within the trauma that are what sort of affect them. And so not just trauma as this label, but really looking like what are the things that then bring up these really identifiable feelings. Because hopefully you get to people, and then so the people can say, you can check in, and sometimes they'll say, I'm fine, and it's really true. Like, yeah, so I might check in with somebody, we have a homicide or whatever, and those are traumatic cases, and, a kid who's witnessed and whatever, and I'll check in with the staff person, and, I feel like we're at the point where they can honestly tell me, like, I'm good, like, or tell me, like, it's this piece of that or this or that that's really getting me.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Nick.
Well, I think this was great, and I think it's good that we did this today, but I think part of the other piece of it too is, when you're talking about children being victimized, or you're talking about murders or deaths and those kinds of things, in a work environment, it's like you go in knowing this is going to be tough. And I've always worked with sex offenders, and so we kind of knew that this was, you're not going to be like someone who's taking
Right.
two out in church on Sunday, so they got
Right.
sent in or whatever. But I think the part that it's important to be careful about too is there's folks that get activated by things that happen in a setting just because maybe they're dealing with authority figures in their life being abusive. So here I am supervising somebody, and this may be still a challenging situation, but not something that would be stereotypically traumatic. And this person reacting to me in a certain way. I remember, this is what jumps into my head when Angela was talking, I remember looking through a paper with this great student. I mean, she was a law student, social work student. And I was reading the paper, and we had a really good relationship, and I said something like, I'm kind of disappointed in the way this went here. And I looked over, she was crying. And I was like, oh my goodness, what happened? And I think what she and I were able to process together is just having an older male tell her
Right.
that he was disappointed in something she did, kick something off that she wouldn't have guessed would have happened.
Right.
And we ended up having a really good conversation about it, but it made me think that, there's the obvious trauma-informed care sensitivity times, but there's also the times where you least think that this is going to be activated. And so I think really being sensitive to,
Right.
as you guys have made the point, the person dictates for themselves
Right.
what is happening. And
Yeah.
you just sometimes got to ride with,
Right.
creating an environment where they can tell you about it.
Yeah, so we have like 30 seconds left, but so that's a great example of a trauma-informed response is to, so you see this person upset and rather say, gosh, this student has, right,
wrong,
is
right.
maybe
What's
weak
wrong
or has
with
some
you?
problems, to say,
Yeah.
something happened here, I wonder what this stirred up for you, right? And so that's a trauma-informed lens. But what I think happens more often is the other thing, the sort of blaming and labeling and, oh no, or what's wrong with this student kind of thing. And so that harkens back to the whole, not what's wrong with me, but what happened to me. So in review, did we meet our goals? Hopefully we established an understanding of the functions of supervision and the basic principles, very basic, of what is trauma-informed care, and then gave you some ideas for how to implement it into supervision and why it's important, and then acknowledging that it can also be tricky and difficult and that there's some challenges to that. So thumbs up if we met that. This is what my son does at school. They have to vote on things. Thumbs up, thumbs in the middle if we sort of did, thumbs down if you didn't get what you came here for. So just real quick, a poll. Yes, is anyone going to do, Nick is doing this. Okay, all right. So we do have to move out of the classroom because there's another class that comes in here, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions since we didn't have as much time for that. And I don't know if you can stick around, but feel free to gap us if you have any thoughts or questions or feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.